I was photographing the sunrise together with a group of photographers. And during that photo shoot, one of the guys asked me a simple question. I gave him a simple answer. But the most interesting part is what followed after that question. So we were photographing, and one of the guys said, Toma, why do we need composition in our photography? And I gave him a simple answer, the straight answer, the answer that came to my mind at that point. And I said to him, well, you need to organize nature's elements in a way that the brain of the viewer understands it, and the viewer can use that as a visual map that will help him or her navigate through our photo and reach the subject. The subject has to be the final destination. And that was a straight answer. But the guy followed up with something that in a way changed the way I'm thinking about composition. Because he said something like this. Well, I'm here, I'm in front of this beautiful landscape. I'm looking at the subject, I'm looking at the thing that I want to photograph. I'm enjoying it. I'm happy because I'm seeing this. And I don't need a foreground element, I don't need S-curves, I don't need all kinds of other things. I don't need to place the subject using the rule of thirds. So I don't need all that. Why? And why the viewer does need a composition. And this is the thing that changed something inside of me, something in the way I'm thinking about composition. And I realized that us as photographers, we are fully connected with all our senses to the landscape in front of us. And we simply enjoy it. And we're simply glad. We're simply glad that we're seeing that. But the viewer, and this is really interesting, the viewer has zero connection to the landscape that he or she is seeing in the photo. And that's why they need a good composition that supports the subject. My name is Toma, and I'm a full-time landscape photographer. I'm doing this from 2009. And if you want to be better in your photography, you can check out my editing courses, you can check out my ebook on landscape photography, and you can benefit from all this information. Now, I want to talk about 5 composition rules. There are more than 5 composition rules, and you can find all of them in one of my courses, but 5 I think that are very important. And I want to give you my perspective. And I will start with the simplest rule of composition, the rule that everybody talks about. And this rule of composition, in my personal opinion, and that's just my personal opinion, it's not a full composition rule. And let me start with the rule of thirds. Now, why am I saying that this is not a fully composition rule? Because I always say to everybody that asks me about this, that the rule of thirds is a good placement suggestion. You can place your subject, as you can see in this photo that I took inside a foggy forest. I have a beautiful tree, an orange tree that is surrounded by all these green trees. The fog helps a lot with the separation and it also eliminates some of the clutter and the chaos of the forest. And the rule of thirds says that you have the tree, you divide the image in 3 parts, horizontally and vertically, and you get the thirds of the image, and you need to place the subject on one of these thirds. Now, the rule of thirds is a good rule or a good suggestion how to place your subject inside the frame, but you need a geometric composition or a composition based on light that will support that subject. And a very important thing is to notice is that you should always be ready to break the rule of thirds if you have interesting things in your photo. Now, a very interesting thing is this. If the horizon line is below the middle of the photo or above the middle of the photo looks much interesting. So you have to interpret the rule of thirds not necessarily related to the placement of the subject, but also related to the placement of the horizon line. You can place the subject, for example, to the left or in the left third or the right third of the image. And if you do this and you have the horizon line straight in the middle of the photo, it looks so strange. There is one situation when you can place the horizon line straight in the middle, and that is when you have the subject straight in the middle. Even in that situation, you can have different landscapes in front of you that, for example, have a beautiful sky. And at that moment, even though the subject is straight in the middle, because you have symmetry to the left and to the right, you tend to favor the sky and include more of the sky. Or you have a really beautiful foreground element with, let's say, with a really huge drop of rocks or what else, or a beautiful forest. Let's move on to the second rule that is very important, and that is leading lines. Leading lines basically are formed by the place where you decide to photograph from. So it's crucial for you to experiment not only with your placement, but with your placement vertically. It's very important to search for this composition point. And when I'm doing this, I often do this without a tripod. I'm doing it also only with the phone. I'm simply looking and trying to search for compositions. You need a way to find your composition freely. And after that, place your tripod and create the composition. As you can see, for example, here I'm photographing a waterfall. And I decided to stay low because there's a tree that grows from one side of the forest, and it grows in a very awkward position. You never see trees growing like that horizontally, but maybe there was a gap over there and that tree was fighting for the light in that location. So maybe that's the reason for this growth. But it creates a really powerful leading line. And also this leading line is further emphasized by the light that goes on the bark of the tree, and you also get some shadows underneath. And because of that, you have a really clear leading line. Now you also have a leading line to the left, which is created by the way the rocks are framed and included inside the photo. Of course, the waterfall is the final point. It is the widest, it has the biggest contrast, the biggest luminosity, and it attracts simply because it's white and the rest of the image is darker. But it helps a lot when you create this intersection of leading lines, and in the area of that intersection or on that vertical, you place the subject. This is a very interesting thing that I want you to remember, and this is something that I learned from painters. So this is something very good. When you have powerful leading lines, those leading lines don't necessarily need to intersect physically. You may have one here and one here, but if you would have to continue those leading lines imaginary, they would intersect. Well, in the area of that intersection, or on the vertical of that intersection, you should place your subject. It's really, really simple, and this is a trick that I learned from painters. Now let's move to the next composition rule that I want to talk about, and that is the S curve. It's a very, very simple composition rule that will help you create a much stronger perspective. So usually you can, for example, sit in the middle of the road and simply photograph towards the end of the road. But if you move to one side, as you see in this photo is done during my photo tour in Tuscany. We were photographing this really dramatic day. You have clouds, you have rain in the distance, and you have this road. And the road has white stone on it, so it stands out. And because of that, I'm moving to the right. I'm placing the road starts to my left, and I'm already creating a diagonal. And then I'm shifting your attention to the left because the road goes to the left, and then again to the right. Hence the name S shape. And this way you get a much more dynamic perspective. And the viewer is led into the image by this S shape. Another composition rule that I want to talk about, this is number 4, by the way, is depth in layers. And a very good way of thinking in landscape photography is to create the idea of depth. The viewer should understand that these elements are closer than those elements, and maybe because of the elements that I'm seeing in the foreground element area, I can make myself or I can better understand the perspective, the true size of the landscape which is in front of me. And this is what you're seeing in this photo that I shot in the Dolomites. And the closest the plane is to me, the darker I make it, or I try to make it, or I try to frame it when the light doesn't shine on it. It is extremely important to have these layers separated by the intensity of the shadow, if you want. You have darker shadow, less darker shadow, and the lightest element is in the background. And this is a very simple way to create layers, and the viewer has a feeling of depth. In the foreground layer, I'm having some pine trees. And you as a person, so you've seen pine trees and you know how big they are. And when you see them this small, and also the background layer, when you see those mountains in the clouds, you're creating some correlations. Okay, look how big it is compared to the pine trees. Look, the mountain gets up to the clouds and the clouds are really high. So your brain begins a story. This is in a way storytelling in landscape photography. And when the brain fills the gaps and tells you the story, you have a better understanding of these things. Another composition rule that is really important is the frame inside the frame. I use it a lot when I'm photographing inside my forest. I'm using trees from one side and the other side of the trail. I also call these elements stop elements. And I have a composition course on my website that talks about these stop elements and how important these stop elements are to force the viewer to look only at the subject. Now, the photo that I want to talk about is this church over here. And I'm sitting in a hallway that it's next to the church, and I'm using one of the archways, or one of the arches, to frame the church. A very important aspect is that next to this arch, there were several other arches, as you can see. But I tried to stay in a way that you don't see those other arches, because if you would have seen them, the whiteness of the sky would have created contrast little elements. And I want the attention of the viewer to go only on this church. And as you can see, I use the rule of thirds to place the church. But I'm using a frame inside the frame as a composition to give it more more power. Now, I hope that this video was useful to you. And if it was useful and you want to be better, you don't want to miss any good information on landscape photography, check out my website and see my editing courses, my course on composition, or my ebook on landscape photography. And until next time, keep on photographing, because it's the only way that you can get better. Bye-bye.